G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our fortnightly series, Unparliamentary, the show that gives you the scoop on what's happening in federal politics with a special guest journalist every fortnight. This week we are joined by Paul Karp, Chief Political Correspondent with Guardian Australia. G'day, Paul.
Hello, thank you for having me, Ebony.
Thanks for joining us. I will just start by acknowledging that we live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Just a reminder that you can find all our upcoming webinars and register for them at australiainstitute.org.au. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money, where we explain big economic and political issues in plain English. You can type questions for Paul into the Q&A box, and you should be able to upvote other people's questions as well. A reminder to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this is being recorded and it will go up on our website later if you have to step out for any reason. So as always, a lot happening in federal politics. The weekend saw massive rallies all around the country for an end to male violence against women. The Prime Minister's called a national cabinet meeting to address this tomorrow. We've got the budget coming up and government in a big stoush with social media companies and looking at not only disinformation and misinformation, but regulating violent and inappropriate content. So lots to get into and to cover. Thanks so much for joining us, Paul. I did want to start with the protests from the weekend, obviously following a number of deaths of women at the hands of their partners this year, in particularly and most recently the alleged murder of Molly Ticehurst by her partner, who was out on bail for a range of violent offences. We did see mass turnout to those rallies right across the country over the weekend. There does seem to be a lot of impetus here that this is a crisis. It does need some special addressing. How has the government and Anthony Albanese approached that so far?
Well, Anthony Albanese has described it as a national crisis, both in his short and controversial contribution to the Canberra rally on Sunday and on a round of TV interviews on Monday morning. He has convened National Cabinet for Wednesday, tomorrow, where he'll talk with state and territory leaders. But I guess a lot of the frustration about the federal response is that, so far it's limited to a list of things that the government have already done, pointing back to the decision in the last budget to increase the eligibility age for the single parenting payment, for example, a very important measure. The paid family and domestic violence leave, also a very important measure. But these are things that have already been done, and yet the scourge of gendered violence continues. So from the government's perspective, they say we're 2 years through a 10-year national plan to eliminate violence against women and children. But from another perspective, if it's incredibly urgent, like they need to be bringing forward measures more immediately to say what they're doing in the short term about it.
Right. And are we expecting anything specific out of this national cabinet that's happening tomorrow? Obviously, this is largely an issue that state governments tend to deal with through state laws and at that level. What do we know about what we're expecting out of national cabinet tomorrow?
Well, we know that they're going to talk about prevention, particularly in the context of online harms. So what that involves, that could be everything from, age verification to to access pornography to, requiring social media companies to deprioritize violent, misogynistic content in their algorithms. So that is going to be quite interesting to see how broad that is, or whether it's just pointing to things that they are already doing, the review of the Online Safety Act. I mean, that we'll have to wait and see. They also want to talk about information sharing about high-risk perpetrators and serial offenders.
Can you explain that in a little bit more detail? Was that something that has come from the federal government or from the state government leaders?
So South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas said that he raised it with the Prime Minister in a conversation on Sunday, and he likened it to the National Firearms Registry, which made it sound like it was going to be a tool for law enforcement to keep better track of people across jurisdictions, alleged offenders or people that they're worried about across jurisdictions. There has also been talk about this in Queensland. The previous Attorney General was calling for this. Shannon Fentiman was calling for this. It wasn't a public register. It was going to be something that they were a tool that law enforcement agencies would use internally. But it's still unclear if there's going to be some joint position or some national effort to do that. We'll have to see at the meeting.
Yeah. And I guess the idea of that is, obviously with that discussion of we're 2 years into a 10-year plan, a lot of focus has been in the education space and creating awareness and respectful relationships. But this, the murder of Molly Ticehurst in particular, has really kind of put the urgency back into the rate at which women are being murdered and the interventions that are really needed right now, I guess. And those are much thornier and trickier things, I guess, to deal with, whether you're at the state or the federal level. I did want to ask in particular about the National Firearms Registry. You wrote a story on that last week. You kind of mentioned Malinauskas making that connection to that. But what was that story that emerged last week about what's happening with that?
So this is a pre-budget announcement of $160 million to set up the National Firearms Registry, and that's funding over 4 years. And I mean, this is an idea that's been more than 30 years in the making. It was a reform that was called for after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, the shooting of 2 Queensland police officers. In December 2022, also renewed calls for a national firearm registry. So this idea is finally getting off the ground with funding announced ahead of the May budget. But as for whether that proves to be a template for some nationally coordinated action on family and domestic violence, still remains to be seen.
Yeah, I guess there's some obvious crossovers there in that if we make that link to the police officers being killed, the number of domestic abuse and domestic violence calls that police attend every year. We saw those shocking statistics out of Victoria in the tens of thousands, something like 60,000, I think it was. Attendances in that state alone. Obviously, add guns into the mix, and that's very volatile. And the Australia Institute actually, a little while back, we did some research, and there's more guns in Australia now than before the Port Arthur massacre. So I think those developments on the registry is very welcome indeed. Before we kind of move away from this issue, I did just want to touch on those rallies over the weekend and the little bit of controversy that the Prime Minister ended up in with the organisers there. Has that more or less resolved itself? Has he spoken any more about that or addressed that issue about whether or not he was invited to speak?
So Anthony Albanese's position is that he was happy not to speak or he was happy to speak. What happened was a disagreement and some hurt and upset and on the organizer Sarah Williams' part about the statement that Albanese made when he took to the stage, which is that he had asked to speak, but hadn't been allowed to. She disputed that version of events and basically called him a liar on social media. And he tried to move past it in a series of interviews where he said he wanted to keep the focus on the issue, not get into a sort of he said, she said about how that happened. Katie Gallagher, the Minister for Women, has explained that there were negotiations beforehand about whether or not government ministers would have to agree to all 5 of the organisers' demands before they would be allowed to speak. Those weren't resolved. They weren't on the speakers list by the time the rally actually happened. But then a lot of the comments at the rally from the speakers were directed at the Prime Minister and his ministers, and that created an expectation from the audience that they would speak. And he came forward. He came forward and offered to do that, but also noting that he was the Prime Minister in doing that, which is a bad look. Like could appear like he was trying to stand over or influence the outcome by citing his higher office. But it would have blown over if he just did what he started to do, which is in his first 2 sentences, he was sticking with the issue. He was talking about we're all here to say no more, and men need to change, governments need to change, everyone needs to do something about this. It was going so well until the 3rd sentence in, and then he brought up his version about whether or not he had or hadn't asked to speak, or whether he had or hadn't been refused. And he just should have steered clear of that. It created bad optics for what was supposed to be, showing that he cared and that he understood the issues and that he was showing up and taking responsibility. So it did end up being an unnecessary distraction.
Yeah, and certainly, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory politically, like already that was quite a different response than what we had seen under the previous government and previous Prime Minister, where, that refusal to kind of engage with those big rallies that we saw at the time. But in any case, hopefully National Cabinet tomorrow, as you said, will put the issue back in the focus rather than the politics, because, yeah, it's certainly a very complex issue and not one that's going to be resolved overnight, but some urgency on the part of state and federal governments would certainly be very welcome, I'm sure. The next thing I wanted to touch on was a couple of exclusives that I feel like you had last week that kind of touch on this area a little bit. You had a report about, or a couple of reports about Border Force and the culture there and sexism and bullying. Can you tell us a little bit about what those revelations were and what they tell us about the culture at Border Force?
Yeah, so the Border Force Commissioner asked the Human Rights Commission to do a series of reports over 5 years about safety respect at work. So looking at gendered bullying and harassment, and whether that's a problem in Border Force. And the reports found absolutely it is. There were 2 reports that I got the summaries of. One of which found that bullying and harassment are normalised in some sections of Australian Border Force, and the other one was a deep dive, particularly on the Marine unit, which said that it wasn't safe for women. It had a survey of I think it was 55 members of the Marine unit, only 9 women, but 100% of those women responded saying that they had witnessed sex harassment, sexual and/or sex-based harassment, and 78% had personally experienced that behaviour. And you look at some of the things from the Respect at Work report on Border Force generally. There were, comments from a team leader about wanting to get rid of all of his part-time workers, who were all women. There was, co-workers withholding information from a pregnant officer on the basis that she wasn't going to be around when, having an interruption in the career after giving birth. So it's just really obvious and stinky examples of discrimination and things that you'd think should be a thing of the past in workplaces. Good on Border Force for commissioning these reports and accepting all the recommendations of both reports. But it wasn't clear to me when I was writing these stories that they were going to own up to any of this publicly. They've owned up to it internally, but it wasn't clear that they were going to make any of these findings transparent.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it is the public service, and these are workers in the context of certainly what's been a very big debate at Parliament House about changing the culture and the norms in Parliament itself, and the culture and behaviour of men in particular at work. So yeah, I guess regretful that there was no intention, as it seems like, to make it public, but maybe a bit of silver lining there that they did it in the first place. And really, I was quite shocked by that finding. I think, was it by the Human Rights Commission, that it's not safe for women. Was that right?
Yes, it was couched as perceived as not safe. So, but yes, that was quite a damning finding, that it rife with inappropriate workplace behaviours, including sexual harassment and bullying. So.
So, I mean, still in the wider context of what seems like a huge amount of violence in the community recently, we've also seen the government in a big stoush with social media, in particular X, and that is in the wake of the stabbings that we saw in Sydney over the previous few weeks. In particular, the stabbing of the in the church that was televised or live streamed at the time, and the difficulty from the e-safety commissioner to get that kind of content removed from social media platforms. It's, we've seen a fairly big stash with Elon Musk and some name calling back and forth, but what's at the guts of this problem that the government is trying to resolve here?
So the e-safety commissioner has some pretty serious powers to order the takedown of material, in this case on the basis of it being graphic and violent. That was issued to X in relation to videos of the Wakely church stabbing incident. X complied insofar as they blocked Australian users from viewing the material, but didn't comply insofar as they didn't take it down worldwide so that no one anywhere could see it. And X said that blocking Australian users should be sufficient because Australia isn't the internet commissar of the world, determining what everyone else in the rest of the world can see. Whereas the e-safety commissioner and the Australian government's position is that, well, if it's still online, then people can still view it in Australia with a VPN, and it doesn't comply with the strict, meaning of, or their understanding of what the legislation means, which is to take it down, not just to block, a large section of the public from viewing it. So that's what the debate comes down to, and I think we're going to see, if he's really determined about it, then I think we're going to see quite a blockbuster case. I mean, it has constitutional elements as well about the implied freedom of political communication, where they said that the e-safety commissioner said that they didn't order takedown of commentary about the incident, just the video itself. But as we know, those things are bound up intrinsically on social media. Like, just look at Senator Ralph Babbitt retweeting the video with a sort of "fuck you" message to the Australian government, as an example of something where you're not really going to be able to separate the video from the commentary about it. So that's going to be quite a big case if it goes the distance. And while it's fun for the Australian government to talk tough about these things, the end result of it might be that the regime is shown to be not that effective if Musk can win in court.
Yeah, and I guess we're coming up again and again against, the global power of these social media networks distributed all across the world. It is hard for sovereign governments in some cases to enforce laws against them. And I guess that is bleeding into other areas as well, particularly after the Wakely church stabbing. We also saw a lot of not only the Wakeley church stabbing, but the Bondi Mall stabbings as well. A lot of disinformation and misinformation circulating on social media, which is also quite hard to regulate and crack down on. And obviously, a lot of that happens kind of in the minutes and hours after an event like that has happened. Are our laws up to date with how social media companies manage that, or do you think that is something that the government's going to be looking at in more detail as well, how to, address misinformation and disinformation on those platforms as well?
Well, I think that the government has seized on these very current examples, but as evidence for why that we should be doing the things that the government is already trying to legislate. So, the misinformation bill is something that was out for consultation and something that they planned to do long before some users on social media and then some mainstream media picked up the misidentification, the incorrect identification of the alleged Bondi Junction stabber. So that became a case study of something that they were already planning to do. There's a review of the Online Safety Act, which is looking at the Safety Commissioner's powers. That's something that they were already going to do. So I think that they've reached for these examples to try and persuade the Australian public, to try and warn the social media companies to cooperate by saying that their social license depends on going along with these sorts of reforms and acting responsibly. But so far, I haven't seen anything that is like a new idea that they weren't going to do, but now is something that they're planning to do as a result of these two most recent incidents.
Yeah, and I guess just to go to the politics of it, this is quite a contentious issue, the regulation of information, I guess. And you kind of mentioned Senator Babbitt there with the FU to the government posting that video that they'd tried to take down. But Peter Dutton has kind of been a bit back and forth on kind of where he lands on this kind of stuff. I mean, there are genuine free speech issues here about government kind of regulating information and what is truth. But at the same time, you can really see that this is quite difficult, that when we look back to some of the misinformation around the Voice campaign or in the wake of big events like this, government clearly has a role to play in making sure misinformation and disinformation isn't making it out there to the public. But it's a thorny issue politically as well as in policy terms, I think, as well.
Yes, and we're still expecting truth in political advertising to be an element of the government's electoral reforms that they're going to introduce by mid-year. So creating some section of the Australian Electoral Commission that's going to be responsible for, labelling things as false and demanding retractions and whatnot when there's outright falsities in political advertising. But that is something that is really only going to stop the absolute most outrageous lies. It's not going to stop a lot of negative campaigning. For example, in the Dunkley by-election, Advance took out ads about the Albanese government letting out 149 foreign criminals, and those sorts of ads I don't think would be captured by such a regime. Like I couldn't fault anything in them for not being factual. It was race baiting. It was incredibly negative. It downplayed, the fact that they released them because the court had ordered, because a court order required it. But it was technically all correct. It's not something that the AEC is going to be getting involved in, and it's very hard to legislate for. It's very hard to legislate for things like that are not false, but are arguably socially damaging.
Yeah. If anyone is interested, the Australian Institute's got quite a bit of research around truth in political advertising, and it is actually in operation in the ACT and in South Australia, and has South Australia's laws are the oldest. So it is in operation in places. As always, it's not perfect, but yeah, it would be really interesting to see what the government comes forward as part of that commitment, and obviously the interest of all the independents on who run on platforms of transparency and accountability as well. Paul, we are heading into the budget, and last week we saw higher than expected inflation figures. I mean, that gives the Treasurer a pretty narrow path to walk in terms of not wanting to push up inflation, but also a lot of people really still struggling to make ends meet in the community. We're obviously going to see the stage 3 tax cuts come in from 1 July, but anticipation is that the government will deliver a budget surplus in this. What's the politics of that going to be for the Treasurer and the Prime Minister when so many people are really struggling out there, and they're going to, be having a surplus with money in the bank?
Well, a month or two ago, inflation was coming down, and Labor were thinking, we're going to get a couple of interest rate cuts, if not this year, then at least by the time of the next election. And they were looking at global growth being, poor. And so they were thinking that the risk was going to be doing too much fighting inflation by taking demand out of the economy and not enough for growth. But now, inflation seems to be a bit stickier, and suddenly the projections are, there might actually be another rate rise or 2 or even 3. Oh my God. And no cuts until next year. And it's just this terrible bind that they're in, where they want to do cost of living relief because households are doing it tough, but then most forms of doing that put more money in people's pocket, and that increases demand in the economy, and that causes inflation, and then that results in the interest rate rises that they're trying to stop. So it's a terrible bind they're in, and the income tax cuts that they've redistributed to make more fair will be very good for households, but that's more money in people's pockets. So the government feels the pressure not to then do other things that could help different households, like increase welfare. They got their Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee advice last week, which said again that the rate of job seeker and other working age payments should be 90% of the pension. Well, I mean, I don't think in this climate they're going to want to do that, because it's just, they would say, too expensive and too inflationary. So they've been very clear that the income tax cuts are the main form of relief that is coming, because they don't want to add to inflation.
Yeah. Having said that, it does strike me that all this time every year we have these conversations around the budget and what we can do to help people, and there's always seems to be a blank check for the Defense Department, which we've seen again in recent weeks, kind of more and bigger announcements about spending in those areas, and never seems to be an issue with how much they cost, or any talk of would that kind of stimulus in the economy be inflationary. So you can see the politics of it being very difficult, as people can see that kind of spending, but not anything for services and things like that. But in the past, we have seen, Paul, the government kind of really intervene quite directly to avoid that inflation problem by kind of reducing the costs of medicines, and kind of intervening where it can directly have control over prices, because that's essentially why people are having trouble making ends meet. Prices are going up more than people's wages are. Is there any more talk around, obviously you've said the kind of hosing down suggestions of income support increases, but we had seen the government in the past look at making arguments to increase the minimum wage, increasing wages for aged care workers in particular. in particular. Is there any more kind of conversation on that side of the equation, what we can do to be increasing wages for workers, or what's happening? Is there anything happening on that front?
Well, on the deflation side, like I think they might roll over the energy price relief again. That's possible. Cutting petrol excise might also be possible. On the wages side, my colleague Amy Ramikis reported that they are going to increase early childhood educators' pay in this budget. So basically, early childhood educators were among the first to launch multi-employer bargaining case mid last year, asking for double-digit pay rises. And basically, you know, a lot of these care economy jobs are competing amongst each other. And now, you know, the Fair Work Commission has ordered what amounts to an average like 23% pay rise in aged care, that it's very difficult to retain early childhood educators. So we're expecting there'll be money for their wages in the budget.
All right. I can see we've got about 430 people on the line with us. Thanks for joining us today. Just a reminder, you can put questions for Paul into the Q&A box there, and we'll get to those very shortly. I did just want to touch on housing, Paul, as another thing. I think people will be expecting some movement in the budget, but not necessarily knowing anything that the government might do. I mean, this is still a very thorny political issue for the government in terms of the Greens putting on a lot of pressure around rents and rent freezes. Not wanting to touch things like negative gearing and the tax concessions. Do we know anything, or is there any recent movement around the housing crisis that so many people are in the middle of at the moment?
Well, Labor still wants to pass its Help to Buy scheme, which is a shared equity scheme that will make it cheaper for some home buyers to get into the market, because the government will own about a third of your house. So you'll need a smaller deposit and less borrowing to afford to buy. But that's basically stalled because the Coalition and the Greens have teamed up to stall it. A very similar dynamic to what we saw with the Housing Australia Future Fund last year. Labor has, like, the Greens want to talk the tax concessions, negative gearing and capital gains tax. Labor says that they're going to put the bill up for a vote, that they're not really negotiating. They want, you know, parties to vote on the merits of that legislation. They're not trying to horse trade to get that through. So there is a bit of an impasse developing there. David Pocock and Jackie Lambie released some interesting advice from the Parliamentary Budget Office last week that showed that you could grandfather the changes. So you could allow people who've already bought homes to keep the existing, you know, 50% capital gains tax discount, or you could limit negative gearing to one property, so that, you know, mum and dad investors who own like literally just one investment property are not affected. And they showed that even with those sorts of limits on revisiting the tax concession, you could still save billions of dollars that could then be invested in social and affordable housing. On the Coalition side, we see that they are ramping up to expand their super for housing policy. They want, you know, people to be able to access more money from their super, for them to not have to pay it back into their super, so long as they're, you know, taking it from, they're selling one house and they're moving into another house. You can keep that chunk of super in your next house, rather than paying it back into your super. And they're also considering allowing existing homeowners to draw down from their super to put into their mortgage offset account, which would reduce interest payments. So on left and right flank, the Coalition and the Greens are looking to the next election to have a housing election, because they know that interest rate rises and, you know, soaring rents have made this such a pressure point for households. And, you know, while the Albanese government has done a lot with, $3 billion extra last year for social and affordable housing, the Housing Australia Future Fund, and their shared equity scheme, which is, stalled at the moment. I don't think that they've done enough when you're getting challenged from your left and right flank, and when senators who people see as sensible centrists like Jackie Lambie and David Pocock are saying that you should be doing more on the tax concessions. So I think they are a bit wedged in every direction on this, and there is a perception forming that they haven't done enough.
Yeah. I'm just wondering after the pandemic, how many young people would have, or older people even, money left in super after a lot of people drew it down during the pandemic. But we might go to sorry.
The pandemic super withdrawals were very popular, and it will have a devastating impact on people's retirement savings who in decades time, but it was, for the people that accessed it, still a popular policy. So I think people are really writing off this super for housing policy because they think, oh, it will be terrible, it just adds to demand, it doesn't make anything more affordable, it will ruin retirement. Yeah, sure, from a system point of view, it can be a terrible idea, but for the individual who's deciding whether or not to access it, it can sound and feel great. And it might actually be it might actually swing votes. I mean, we had an Essential poll that showed that all of these options, the Greens public housing developer, and the coalition's super housing policy, were both very popular.
Yeah.
I don't think we should count that idea out just because we can see that there are reasons that it might not work.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. We might go to questions from the audience now. Just a reminder, you can type them into the Q&A box, and you can also upvote questions from other people. The first question I've got is from Ronald Smith, who asks or observes that the opposition leader didn't attend the rally on the weekend. Has anyone asked Peter Dutton why he didn't, or what his opinion is of what happened over the weekend?
He said he's on a unity ticket with the government in terms of wanting to find solutions to the crisis of violence against women. I don't think he's personally said why he didn't attend. But he also, in the next breath, after saying let's look for solutions, he also demanded that the government that Anthony Albanese apologise to the organizer Sarah Williams. So they are sort of enjoying the pain of seeing Albanese squirm in a sort of repeat of not as bad, but Scott Morrison got in trouble for saying overseas these protesters would be shot at, and compounding his troubles with women with insensitive remarks. And so they think the coalition want to play up that dynamic. No, they haven't really been held accountable for why they weren't in attendance. No.
The next question is from Roger Tonkin, and it's, I guess, related or on the same issue. So he points out the government has announced the 10-year plan to reduce domestic violence, but feels like there's minimal details, if any, about what is in the plan. Can you shed any more light about what's in it and what's expected to unfold over the next 8 years?
Well, it is things like funding for frontline services, but there's, disputes about whether they're spending enough. I think they're doing $2.5 million over 5 years at the moment, and there are calls from the sector to give like $1 billion every year. So that's roughly doubling it. So there is money for frontline services. There are also, some things that are education and type pieces for prevention, which people have grown quite sick of as, too symbolic, not doing enough. I had Amanda Rishworth on the Australian Politics podcast about a month or so ago, and she was talking about a program called Positive Masculinities, where they were basically going to try and find and boost role models to counter the sort of toxic masculinity embodied by people like Andrew Tate. So they were going to try and inject more positive role models into the system, which sounds like quite an indirect way of tackling the problem. But at least they're thinking about, why young people might be getting influenced in the wrong direction. So there are some concrete measures there, but I think there is growing frustration at the how symbolic it all is. I really appreciated the contributions of Michael Salter and Jess Hill to advocates and academics in this space who argue that we need to be doing more to tackle the industries that profit from and push people towards more problematic behavior. So things like alcohol, social media, gambling. These are industries that the government could more directly be doing things, and then you wouldn't have to. It wouldn't just be about education and frontline services. It would be true prevention, as they call it.
Yeah, I guess if people want to check that out, they wrote a piece for Guardian Australia that you can find on their website about what that primary prevention looks like. And I also was really interested in kind of the things that they were writing about. It was moving away from kind of that education and awareness to how can we tackle some of these problems. And I mean, we do know from research that, for example, when big things like big sporting events like the State of Origin are on, whoever the losing team is, it can correlate with a rise in domestic abuse and abuse of other men and things like that, street fights and all that kind of stuff. So there are some direct links there between alcohol and violence, as you say, and some of those other industries and violence that they could be looking at. The next question that I've got is from Deborah Carroll, who says that the video of the priest being stabbed is still available on YouTube. What are the implications for the government court case if they only go after Twitter but not other social media platforms?
Well, I think the takedown orders are specific to particular sites and particular instances, like particular URLs and users that shared it. So I think that X can comply by taking down all 65 versions that they were told to take down, but there could still be 165 other versions on X, and there could be versions on YouTube and all the rest of it. I think it undermines the consistency and the moral legitimacy of the regime. I don't think that that's necessarily a fatal blow to the legality of it, because the e-safety commissioner made a direction about particular instances on a particular website. So that the fact that it exists on YouTube is interesting, but it doesn't answer the question of whether or not what X has done complies with that order.
Yeah. Susie Hammond has a question here about, she says, do you have any thoughts on how to stop the clickbait addicted media from publishing articles which could be best described as, quote, DV porn? I'm not quite sure what she's referring to there, but I guess it is something that the media still struggles to do. And I'm not, not picking out any media in particular here, but we still do see a lot of these hagiographies of the perpetrator and what a good bloke they were, and headlines that kind of don't talk about, who did the killing of a particular woman. Paul, can you tell us what are some of the things that the media has to take into consideration when reporting on these things? Because obviously there's the considerations that the community is looking for, that the perpetrators correctly identified, and that we don't kind of hide the fact that this is men's violence against women often. But then you also have to come up against things like, for court reporting, sub judice and what is permissible to report. Would you mind just filling the audience in, I guess, a little bit on what the media has to do when reporting on this issue and do better?
Well, yes. So we get people very upset at us for saying like the alleged perpetrator or alleged stabber or all the rest of it, which we are including because, as you say, it can be contempt of court if you are prejudicing the trial. So we're not doing that because we think that they didn't do it, and we're trying to be nice to people that have committed crimes. We're just trying to leave that open so that it doesn't prejudice a jury, so that, you know, if something is tried, that it's not cruelled by that you know, potential jurors aren't polluted by prejudgment in the media. So that's why we do that. In terms of what we could be doing better, I mean, looking at the demands of the No More rally, a lot of them were directed at the media. It included the media having to wait 48 hours to before identifying victims of violence, mandatory victim blaming prevention training, which was including you know, training of the media, so not blaming victims for crimes that were committed against them, for example, by gratuitous reporting about you know, if they were a sex worker or what they were wearing or things like that. I mean, we have our own MIA, Media Union code of ethics, which also involves not including gratuitous details like that. But, you know, the hagiography stuff, the like, oh, you know, but for having allegedly killed someone, this guy was a great guy. Like, there's no rule against that. I mean, it should just be common sense that you know, you don't hold them up in a positive light when the reason that they've come to public attention and that they're it's a matter of public interest is because they're accused of having, you know, committed an act of violence.
Yeah. What else? Sorry, I was just paying attention to what you were talking about and not what the next question is here. David Morrison has asked about the issue with the e-safety commissioner being that if she can ban material worldwide, what's to stop other countries from banning material worldwide and then closing down the internet? The argument at present is about Australia's sovereignty, but where does Australia get the right to impose its views on the sovereignty of other countries? I guess that's what the court will answer, Paul, to a certain extent.
I see the force in that argument, and Peter Dutton said that he sort of agrees with Musk that we can't be the world police of the internet. And you know, Media Watch last night, Paul Barry, you know, agreed with that aspect of Musk's argument that, like, what's to stop other countries doing that? So I can see the force in that. But, you know, if Parliament has legislated this regime, the court is answering a much narrower question, which is, you know, is this legislation constitutional? Was this direction made according to the legislation? And then did X comply with the direction? It's a much narrower set of questions than, you know, is it good in a policy sense? Would it wreck the internet? Would we hate it if China did it? Well, yes, we probably would hate it if China did it. But Parliament has legislated this power, and those policy questions probably won't determine how the court rules one way or the other.
Yeah. I've got a question here from David, who asks, any thoughts on the recently released report by ICANN Australia, sorry, a video where parliamentarians call for a nuclear weapon-free world? I'm not sure if you are aware of that, Paul, but it also does make me think about the coalition's policy for a nuclear-powered Australia. Any thoughts on that, the nuclear weapon-free world, or indeed any updates on the coalition's plan for a nuclear-powered Australia?
Well, I can see that my colleague Daniel Hurst, the Foreign Affairs correspondent, has posted to the blog about it, and there's a politicians across the political spectrum that signed up for that message. So from Labor, Josh Wilson, Susan Templeman, Sam Lim, Louise Pratt, Sharon Clayton, and Josh Burns. Greens, Lydia Thorpe, Monique Ryan, Russell Broadbent, and the LNP's Warren Entsch. So yes, some support from across the political aisle for that. I mean, generally, nuclear, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was something that Anthony Albanese was maybe hotter on when he was in opposition, not when he was Prime Minister. And I don't think there's been a lot of progress to Australia signing up to that, but I'll have to consult Daniel for more on that. What was the aspect of that question that went to coalition policy?
Oh, it was more a jumping off point into that. The question was around nuclear weapons, but my head went to the coalition's nuclear policy, which we're supposed to be getting some more details of before the budget. Is that right? Have we heard any more on that front?
They've reneged on that. There was months of exclusives on the front page of the Australian that the coalition is about to have a nuclear policy. They're determined to have one. They're going to put the nuclear power plants where the coal power plants used to be, or they're considering that that's where they may go. But the policy may say where they may go when they may, announce it. And so it was it's so heavily hedged for many months, and now it turns out the reason is that it's very unpopular. They don't want to ruin their chances in the Queensland state election by announcing it too early. It's very obvious. You can draw up the half dozen or so electorates that have coal power plants in them and work out where the nuclear power plants would be. And some of the local members of those electorates, with the exception of David Littleproud, are not very happy to have them there, and say that, Darren Chester, for example, says that you would need to have a social compact, which basically means you'd have to buy off the local communities by giving them stuff, including maybe free power. So it's not very popular in the places that it would need to be implemented. And so that they need to go back to the drawing board and think a bit harder about it, I think, about how to win support for it at the local level first, so that it doesn't come unstitched at the seams.
Yeah.
I mean, my colleagues had a story about every state Liberal leader was actually anti this thing. So it's not terribly popular. It's not going terribly well.
Yeah, a bit of a, policy on the never, never to begin with, but in the end, can't even get internal agreement amongst the coalition, it sounds like, to do it. The last question I've got here is from Jill Newton, who asks about improving HECS by reducing interest repayments on accumulated interest, and if there's a possibility of free childcare in the budget. So 2 questions there, I guess. There has been a bit of a focus on HECS. The Australia Institute earlier this year shined a spotlight on the fact that the government collects more revenue from HECS than it does from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, which has, really cut through, I think, to people about how broken the PRRT is, but has also really shined a spotlight on how expensive HECS has become and how it's indexed. Are we expecting anything in the budget on that front?
The University Accord said that it should be the lower of the wage price index or the CPI inflation that HECS debt should increase by. I think they are going to enact that recommendation. The problem, though, is that the 2 worst years are the years we just had. And Andrew Norton, the academic, has said that basically, this policy would have only had an impact 4 out of the last 20 or 30 years. So the problem was in the year that it went up 7.1% and the most recent rise, which is going to be over 4%. So the question is whether they do more than just the lower of the two. They could do, they could backdate it. They could backdate it a few years. That would, say, well, that year that it was 7.1, it should have been 3.5. So we're just going to write off some of everyone's debt. So there are options that are more generous.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're going to feel more generous, or whether they're just going to do what the Accord said and move on and hope that the fuss dies down, because inflation is reducing. So hopefully the heat from their perspective will come out of it.
Yeah, they only have to endure the pain for a couple of years politically. Paul, any other observations as we head into the budget over the next fortnight? Anything else we're expecting kind of prior to then, or coming out, I guess, anything else coming from National Cabinet that we should keep an eye out for?
In terms of the budget, I mean, looking for more content about what the future made in Australia means. So far, we know that it means, $1 billion for solar panels and $1 billion for quantum computing. But it's got to be more than just random pots of money for things. It has to be, they're not going to compete with the Inflation Reduction Act by you can't spend more money than the US. So it has to be something else, like tax incentives to encourage companies to come here, or something to provide certainty to investors. So exactly what the future made in Australia is going to be an important feature. I also think that the budget will continue the narrative of cracking down on international students and trying to reduce arrivals and net migration. The tertiary education sector is bracing for a big hike on application fees for international students. So I think that having now set themselves this informal target of halving the rate of net migration, that there's going to have to be more work in the budget, and it will also be a handy revenue raiser for them to do that.
Yeah.
So those are some of my budget tips.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thanks so much for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. As I said, we had about 430 people on the line with us today. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all your questions. Thanks to the people who alerted us to that problematic person in the chat. Just a reminder, we will boot out people like that, so you can let us know if someone in the comments is concerning to you. And thanks again, everyone, for coming along. Next week, we are talking to author Bree Lee about her new novel, The Work, for Australia's biggest book club. And when Unparliamentary returns in a fortnight, it will be with Rachel Withers from The Politics, and we'll be talking all things budget. Thanks very much, Paul, for your time. And thanks, everyone. And we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Ebony.
Cheers. Bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.